The sound of children laughing filled the warm summer air, a melody that once seemed foreign to Isaac Carter. For years, his world had been filled with the echoes of gunfire, the whispered last breaths of dying men, and the silent weight of orders that never should have been given. But here, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, those horrors felt like a different lifetime. His son, Elijah, was the reason for that. "Go on, buddy," Isaac called, tossing a bright blue ball across the yard. Elijah, small but quick for a 7-year-old, sprinted after it, his laughter ringing through the air. His curly hair bounced with each step, and his oversized sneakers nearly tripped him as he lunged for the ball. Isaac chuckled, hands on his hips. This was what he had fought for. Not medals, not commendations, not some empty notion of honor. This, a life where his son could run without fear, where bedtime stories replaced battlefield briefings, where hugs meant more than handshakes drenched in blood. Elijah turned back, grinning. "Dad, did you see that?" Isaac crouched to meet him at eye level, ruffling his hair. "I saw it, champ. You're getting faster." Elijah beamed, but then his face turned serious, his big brown eyes locking onto his father's. "Dad, do you promise you'll never go away?" The question hit Isaac harder than any bullet ever had. He swallowed, forcing a smile. "Of course, buddy. I'm right here, always." Elijah nodded, satisfied, then turned to chase his ball as it rolled toward the street. The moment should have been nothing, a boy retrieving his toy, but the world wasn't fair. The world was vicious. Isaac saw them too late. A police cruiser rolled down the street at an easy pace, the officers inside chatting. Elijah, too excited to notice, ran after his ball, his small frame dashing toward the pavement just as the cruiser braked. The doors flew open. 2 officers stepped out, hands already on their weapons. They weren't thinking. They weren't looking. They weren't seeing a child. "Hey, stop!" one of them barked, his voice sharp like a whip. Elijah froze, clutching his ball to his chest. His face twisted in confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. Isaac moved, his instincts firing faster than thought, his legs carrying him toward his son. But he was too far. Too far. Before he could reach them, the officer lunged forward, a grown man, armed, trained against a 7-year-old. Elijah screamed as the cop grabbed him by the collar and slammed him face down onto the pavement. The sound, that tiny, fragile body hitting the asphalt, ripped through Isaac's soul. The world blurred, the heat of the sun turned ice cold. A father's heartbeat stopped, then restarted as a war drum. "Elijah!" Isaac's voice roared across the street. The officer, stocky, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, pressed his knee into Elijah's back, pinning the boy as if he were some dangerous criminal. The second cop, taller and leaner, stood nearby, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Isaac reached them in seconds, but it felt like eternity. His son was crying, struggling. His baby, his world. "That's my son," Isaac growled, his voice low, dangerous. "Get your hands off him." Buzzcut didn't move. Your kid ran toward a police vehicle in a suspicious manner. Isaac's fists clenched so hard his nails cut into his own palms. A 7-year-old retrieving a ball was suspicious? The second cop, Connors, his badge red, stepped forward. "Sir, you need to step back." His hand still rested on his gun. Isaac took another step closer. His voice turned razor sharp. "Take your knee off my son." Elijah sobbed. "Daddy, it hurts." Something inside Isaac snapped. His past rushed back in a tidal wave. The endless missions, the split-second decisions between life and death, the ability to dismantle a threat before they even knew they were in danger. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his son. He forced his hands to unclench, his breathing to steady. The old him, the ghost, the one who had been trained to eliminate problems rather than talk them down, wanted to kill these men where they stood. But Elijah needed a father, not an executioner. So instead of breaking bones, Isaac reached into his pocket and slowly, deliberately pulled out his phone. "I'm recording," he said, "and so is every security camera on this street." The words landed. Buzzcut hesitated. He knew this wasn't some nameless victim they could brush under the rug. Knew they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Finally, he lifted his knee, jerking Elijah to his feet like a rag doll. "You should teach your kid to stay away from police cars," he muttered. Elijah ran into his father's arms, burying his face against Isaac's chest, sobbing. Isaac held him tight, rubbing slow circles on his back, whispering, "I've got you, buddy. I've got you." Then, his eyes lifted to the officers, and the ghost finally stared back at them. Name and badge number. Connor smirked. You're nobody, Carter. A cold, quiet rage settled into Isaac's bones. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, he said, his voice so calm it sent a shiver down Buzzcut's spine. Isaac didn't notice the woman across the street holding up her phone, recording. He didn't see the traffic camera that captured everything. He didn't care, because as he carried Elijah inside, one thought consumed him. They hurt his son. Now, they would learn what it meant to awaken the ghost. The world outside could burn for all Isaac cared. He sat on the edge of Elijah's bed, gently brushing damp curls from his son's forehead. The boy was asleep now, but his breathing was uneven, his small body twitching from the aftershocks of fear. Isaac had checked every inch of him, his ribs, his back, the angry red marks that would bloom into bruises by morning. Each one was a wound carved into his father's soul. A child should never have to say, "Daddy, it hurts." The words echoed in his mind, an open wound festering with something dark, something deadly. Mrs. Wilson, their elderly neighbor, stood at the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The kind woman who had spent her years baking cookies and knitting scarves looked ready to murder someone. "I saw the whole thing," she whispered, fury trembling in her voice. "They slammed that baby down like a criminal, like an animal." Isaac exhaled, forcing down the fire in his chest. "Thank you for staying with him tonight." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, then stepped closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Whatever you're about to do, son, make sure they don't see you coming." She didn't need to say anything else. She knew. Isaac nodded, pressing a hand to Elijah's back one last time before standing. The boy's breathing had steadied. For now, for tonight. Because tomorrow, the world would learn what happens when you push a father too far. The first mistake, Isaac locked himself in his home office and powered on his laptop. His fingers moved without hesitation, without thought. Old habits took over. The man he used to be clawed his way back to the surface, cold and efficient. Lines of code flooded the screen as he bypassed police firewalls with sickening ease. The system should have stopped him. But there was no firewall in existence that could keep out the ghost. The files on Officer Jake Reynolds and Detective Brian Connors appeared in seconds. His jaw clenched. This wasn't their first time. Complaint after complaint, excessive force, wrongful arrests, civil rights violations, all buried, all dismissed. How many fathers had gone to bed tonight feeling the same rage clawing through Isaac's veins? His eyes flicked to another file, cross-referenced in the system, a name that made his blood turn to ice, General Victor Langley. Isaac went completely still. He clicked the file. It was thin, too thin, but the few pieces of data were enough to make something inside him coil like a viper. Langley had personally signed off on Connor's transfer. Why would a former high-ranking military officer, one who had personally trained the ghost, be placing corrupt detectives in suburban police departments? Isaac's gut tightened. This wasn't about bad cops anymore. This was bigger. A cold smile ghosted across his lips. Then let's see how deep this hole goes. He inserted a blank USB drive, copying every file. Then he pulled out his phone and sent a message to a number he hadn't dialed in years. "Isaac Carter, I need to talk." "Jesus, you back from the dead?" "I need a location." "Who's the target?" "Langley." A long pause. Then Miles responded, "I'll be at your place in an hour. Bring whiskey." A father's wrath. Isaac arrived at the police station before sunrise. He wasn't there to file a complaint. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to send a message. The night shift was changing over. Officers shuffled in and out, tired and distracted. Perfect. Isaac walked through the front entrance like a shadow slipping through cracks. A few officers glanced his way, but no one stopped him. He moved through the halls with precise, practiced steps, his heartbeat a steady drum. Find Connors. Find Reynolds. Make sure they know exactly what they've done. Through the glass office window, he spotted Connors, laughing with another officer over stale coffee. The same man who had smirked at him last night. The same man who had told him he was nobody. Isaac stepped inside. The conversation died. Connors turned, his smirk already forming, until he saw Isaac's eyes. The detective swallowed. "Carter," he forced a chuckle. "What brings you down here? Got a complaint to file?" Isaac closed the door behind him, slowly, deliberately. Connor shifted uneasily. You can't just walk in here. Isaac was in front of him before the man could finish his sentence. One step, one heartbeat. His fingers latched onto Connor's wrist, the one reaching for his gun. A flick of pressure, a sharp twist. Crack. Connors let out a strangled cry as his wrist snapped like a twig. The coffee mug shattered on the floor. The other officer lurched backward, but Isaac's glare froze him in place. Isaac leaned in close, his voice so soft it was deadly. You put your hands on my son. Connors gasped, his breath shaking. Isaac tightened his grip. You hurt him. You made him cry. His free hand grabbed Connors by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Connors' pulse pounded beneath Isaac's fingers. The man was terrified. Isaac let the silence stretch, let the fear sink in. Then he whispered, I want you to think about that. Every single night. Because this... He twisted Connor's wrist a fraction more, earning another choked cry. This is nothing compared to what's coming. He released him. Connors collapsed, cradling his arm like a broken wing. Isaac turned to the second officer. Where's Reynolds? The man paled. I don't know. Isaac smiled. Then tell him to run. He left the office as smoothly as he had entered. Officers were starting to gather, but none dared stop him, because every single one of them saw it in his eyes. The man they had provoked was no ordinary civilian. They had hurt the wrong child. And now, the ghost was awake. The air in Isaac's home was thick with tension. Shadows stretched long against the walls, cast by the single lamp on his desk. In the dim glow of the screen, the files on General Victor Langley flickered back at him like ghosts from his past. His son's assault hadn't been a random act of brutality. It was a message, a test, and the men behind it had underestimated just how dangerous their target was. Isaac's fingers tapped against the wooden desk in a slow, measured rhythm. Across the room, Miles Carter, his oldest friend and former Delta Force teammate, leaned against the doorway, watching him. You gonna tell me why you just broke a detective's wrist in the middle of a police station? Miles's voice was rough, the same voice that had barked orders in war zones, the same voice that had once pulled Isaac back from the edge of hell. Isaac didn't look away from the screen. They put their hands on my kid. Miles exhaled sharply. Damn. Isaac finally turned, his gaze locked onto his friend. Langley's name is all over this. Miles' face darkened. You sure? Isaac nodded, tapping the screen. Connors and Reynolds weren't just dirty cops. They were placed there, transferred in. Someone in power signed off on that. Miles moved closer, scanning the files. So Langley's running more than just a private army. He's placing people in law enforcement, in key government positions. Isaac's voice was quiet, but his eyes burned. And he wanted to see if I'd react. Miles shook his head. He already knows who you are, what you're capable of. Why test you? Isaac's jaw clenched. Because he wants me back. Silence. Then Miles exhaled. You're saying Langley staged this? Had his men target your kid just to see if the ghost was still in there? Isaac's hands tightened into fists, and I gave him his answer. Miles ran a hand over his shaved head, letting out a slow breath. All right, so what's the move? Isaac's response was immediate. I go hunting. Miles smirked. Knew you were going to say that. He pulled a flask from his jacket, taking a sip before offering it to Isaac. Isaac took it, but didn't drink. He just stared at the liquid inside, deep in thought. Langley doesn't make mistakes, Isaac murmured. If he put his name on these transfers, it means he wants me to see them. He wants me to come after him. Miles frowned. Which means? Isaac met his gaze. Which means this isn't the real trap, it's just the bait. An invitation to war. At precisely 11:45 p.m. Isaac's phone vibrated. A number he didn't recognize, but he knew exactly who it was. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Carter. A deep chuckle rumbled through the line. General Victor Langley. Ah, Ghost. I was beginning to think you wouldn't pick up. Isaac leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening around the phone. You made a mistake, Langley. A pause. Then, amusement. You still think this is about mistakes? No, Carter. This is about potential. Isaac's voice was ice. You sent your men after my son. I did no such thing, Langley replied smoothly. But I will admit, I was curious to see how you'd respond. Isaac's heartbeat thundered in his ears. And, Langley chuckled. You didn't disappoint. That detective you broke, he's already making calls. The media is getting wind of what happened. A father, an unknown father, fighting against the system. People love that story. Isaac's jaw flexed. What do you want, Langley? I want you back. Silence. Langley sighed, as if speaking to an old friend. You left something unfinished, Carter. The world is different now. It's not about countries anymore, or flags. It's about power. Who holds it? Who enforces it? Who decides who gets to live and who disappears? Isaac's fingers curled around the armrest. I already made my choice. Langley's voice turned steel sharp. Then why are you here, hunting ghosts in the night? Why did you break a cop's wrist, hack police records, wake up the part of yourself you swore you buried? Isaac's silence was answer enough. Langley continued, his voice growing softer. You want to believe you can walk away, that you can be a father first. But tell me, Carter, when you looked at your son's bruises, did you really see your boy, or did you see a mission? Isaac's breath stilled. Langley's voice dropped to a whisper. You can lie to everyone else, but you can't lie to me. I know you, and I know what you are. Isaac closed his eyes. He knew exactly what Langley was doing. Digging, pushing, seeing if there was still something inside him that could be controlled. He exhaled. You're right, Langley hummed in approval. I usually am. You do know me? I do, and that's why you should already know what I'm about to say. Langley chuckled. Let's hear it. Isaac's voice turned deadly soft. You touched my son. That means I'm going to take everything from you. A pause. Then Langley laughed. I'd be disappointed if you didn't try. The line went dead. Isaac set the phone down carefully, his mind already calculating the next move. Miles raised an eyebrow. Well? Isaac stood, rolling his shoulders. I need to disappear for a few days. Get into the places Langley thinks are untouchable. Miles smirked. You planning on sending a message? Isaac's eyes burned. No, I'm planning on starting a war. The first rule of war is simple. Never let your enemy dictate the battlefield. Isaac knew this rule better than anyone, and yet Langley thought he had him cornered. He thought a few bruises on Elijah would be enough to awaken the ghost and pull him back under control. He was wrong. Isaac had spent his entire career dismantling warlords, terrorist networks, and covert military operations that the world wasn't even supposed to know existed. Langley may have set the bait, but Isaac would choose the battlefield. And it would be a battlefield that Langley and his entire corrupt empire would never walk away from. A father's vow. Before the war could begin, Isaac needed to do one thing: hold his son. Elijah was still asleep when Isaac stepped into his room. The soft glow of the nightlight painted gentle shadows over the boy's face, his breathing steady, peaceful. His tiny chest rose and fell, unburdened by the horrors his father had spent a lifetime keeping at bay. Isaac knelt beside the bed and reached out, brushing a lock of curly hair from Elijah's forehead. His skin was still marred with fading bruises, ugly reminders of what had happened. This world doesn't deserve you, son, but I will make damn sure it never takes you from me. Elijah stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. Sleepy brown eyes met Isaac's, and the boy smiled. Dad? His voice was soft, groggy. Isaac forced himself to smile. Yeah, buddy, I'm here. Elijah reached out, his small fingers curling around Isaac's wrist. You weren't here when I woke up this morning. Isaac swallowed hard. I know, I had to take care of something. The boy yawned, snuggling deeper into his pillow. You always say that. A pang of guilt hit Isaac's chest. Elijah was too young to understand what his father had done before leaving the military, but he wasn't blind. He saw the way Isaac's hands clenched into fists whenever the news showed footage of corrupt politicians. He saw the way his father's eyes darkened when he thought no one was watching. He knew, somehow, that his dad carried the weight of something heavy. And now that weight had come for them both. Isaac squeezed Elijah's hand gently. I'm here now, and I always will be. Promise? Isaac's throat tightened. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of his son's head. I promise. But promises only mattered if you were strong enough to keep them. And Isaac would make sure nothing, not Langley, not the corrupt police, not the entire damn government, would ever touch his son again. The hunt begins. At exactly 2:47 a.m., Isaac slipped into the shadows. He was no longer the man who had spent years pretending to be a normal civilian. The ghost had returned. His first target, Detective Brian Connors. The man who had smiled as his officers slammed a 7-year-old boy into the pavement. The man who had called Isaac a nobody. Isaac watched from the roof of a nearby building as Connors stumbled into his apartment complex, drunk and oblivious. His expensive suit was disheveled, his tie loosened as he fumbled with his keys. Isaac moved like the wind, silent, unseen. By the time Connors pushed his front door open, Isaac was already inside. The detective barely had time to react before a strong hand clamped over his mouth and shoved him hard against the wall. Isaac's voice was a whisper of death against Connors' ear. "You should have walked away." Connors thrashed, but Isaac tightened his grip, pressing him harder into the drywall. "You're going to answer a few questions," Isaac murmured, his voice calm, composed. "And if I like your answers, you might still be breathing when I walk out of here." Connor's muffled screams were music to his ears. The truth revealed. 10 minutes later, Isaac had everything he needed. Connors, sobbing, bleeding from a broken nose, had spilled everything. Langley's contacts in the police force, the blackmail operations, the offshore accounts funding their entire network. And the worst part, Elijah was never the end game. Langley had wanted to test Isaac, but the real objective was to get Elijah into the system. They were going to take him, Connors sobbed. "Frame you. Make it look like you were unfit to be a parent. Put your son into protective custody, then make him disappear. You'd have gone crazy trying to find him, and by the time you did, it would have been too late." A slow, methodical breaking. Not just a test, not just bait, a trap. Isaac saw red. They were going to steal his son. Connors barely had time to scream before Isaac's fist cracked against his jaw, knocking him unconscious. By the time the detective woke up, his entire police file would be leaked to the press, and the corruption he had hidden for years would be dragged into the light. But Connors wasn't Isaac's real target. Langley was. A warning sent in blood. At 4 a.m., a black SUV pulled up to Langley's estate. His guards were armed, alert, and moving in tight formations. They weren't just security, they were former military. Langley wasn't just expecting Isaac, he was waiting for him, but he wouldn't see him coming. Isaac moved through the darkness like a ghost, slipping past security cameras, avoiding patrol routes. He left no footprints, no sound. And when the guards finally found something amiss, it was already too late. Because inside Langley's estate, on his desk, was a single photograph. A photo of Detective Connors, unconscious, with the words "You lose" carved into his arm. And beside it, a blood-stained bullet, one that had been removed from the body of an assassin Langley had sent after Isaac years ago. A warning, a promise. The next time Isaac Carter came, it wouldn't be in the shadows, it would be in blood and fire. The first shot had been fired. Langley had spent years orchestrating silent wars from the safety of his empire, believing himself untouchable. But now, for the first time in his life, someone was hunting him. And not just anyone. The ghost. Isaac Carter didn't operate with bureaucratic red tape. He didn't send cease and desist letters. He didn't negotiate. He eliminated threats. Langley had made a critical mistake. He had made it personal. And now there was no turning back. A father's duty before Isaac could strike again, he had one priority. Elijah. By the time the sun rose over their neighborhood, Isaac was back inside his home, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. His hands were steady, his breathing even. Years of combat had taught him how to compartmentalize violence. But the moment Elijah's small feet padded into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes, everything softened. "Morning, Dad," the boy mumbled, yawning. Isaac forced a smile. "Morning, buddy." Elijah climbed into his seat, reaching for the cereal box, but then he hesitated. He studied Isaac the way only a child could, with deep, unfiltered honesty. "Are you okay?" Isaac paused, a second too long. "Yeah, buddy, I'm fine." Elijah frowned. "You were gone last night." Isaac's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "I had to take care of something." There was that phrase again. I had to take care of something. It had become a habit, a shield. But Elijah wasn't 7 years old anymore. He was smart. Too smart. "Was it about the police?" he asked quietly. Isaac inhaled slowly. He could lie. He could tell his son that everything was fine, that the world was fair and just, that good always won. But that wasn't the world Elijah lived in, and Isaac Carter never lied to his son. "Yes," he admitted, "but you don't have to worry about them anymore." Elijah's small hands clenched into fists. "I wasn't scared," he said quickly, almost defiantly, but his voice wavered. "I mean, I was, but I didn't cry." Isaac's heart clenched. He set his coffee down and reached across the table, placing a hand over Elijah's. His son's fingers were still tiny, still full of innocence. "You don't have to be brave all the time, Elijah," he said gently. "Being scared doesn't make you weak." Elijah looked away. "You're never scared." Isaac let out a quiet breath. "If only you knew, son. I get scared all the time," he admitted. "Every single day." Elijah's gaze snapped up in surprise. "You do?" Isaac nodded. "You know when I'm the most scared? When? When I think about something bad happening to you." Elijah blinked. "I would fight anyone in the world to protect you, Elijah. But the idea of losing you?" Isaac swallowed, his throat tight. "That scares me more than anything." For a long moment, Elijah just sat there, staring at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. Then, slowly, his small fingers uncurled and he squeezed Isaac's hand. "I won't let anything happen to you either, Dad." Isaac let out a shaky breath. "Deal." And just like that, the war wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about making sure Elijah never had to live in fear again. Langley's next move. By 3 p.m., Isaac was back in the fight. He sat in his security firm's private office, reviewing the dossiers he had stolen from Connors. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Police, judges, politicians, high-ranking military officers, all of them were connected to Langley's network. And at the center of it all was an offshore military facility hidden under a shell corporation. Isaac exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. That's where Langley is keeping his real assets. But before he could act, his secure line buzzed. "Miles." Isaac answered immediately. "Tell me you have something." Miles' voice was grim. "Langley's already making his move." Isaac straightened. "What? He just put out a $10 million bounty on you." Isaac's blood ran cold. "Every mercenary, ex-military contractor, and cartel enforcer in the country is about to come knocking on your door," Miles continued. "And that's not even the worst part." Isaac's grip on the phone tightened. "What's worse than a hit squad?" Miles hesitated. "They're targeting Elijah." The world stopped. For the first time in years, Isaac felt something he thought he had buried long ago. Pure, unfiltered, mind-breaking rage. "Where is he right now?" Isaac asked, his voice eerily calm. "With Mrs. Wilson at her house. I have 2 men posted outside, but I'm on my way." Isaac ended the call and grabbed his gun. Langley just made his final mistake, a father's wrath. By the time Isaac reached Mrs. Wilson's house, his instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. The 2 men Miles had stationed outside were gone, and the front door was ajar. Isaac moved like a shadow, gun raised, silent, deadly. He slipped inside the house, clearing each room methodically. No bodies, no blood. But the living room showed signs of struggle, a tipped-over chair, a shattered picture frame. Then he heard it. A soft, muffled whimper. Isaac's heart pounded. He followed the sound to the hallway closet. With one swift motion, he yanked the door open, gun ready. And there, huddled in the corner, was Elijah and Mrs. Wilson. They were bound, gagged, terrified. Isaac instantly dropped to his knees, pulling the gag from Elijah's mouth. "Are you okay?" Elijah nodded frantically, tears in his eyes. "They took them, Dad." "Who?" Elijah swallowed. "The men outside. They came inside. They said they were here to take me, but Mrs. Wilson fought them." Isaac turned to the elderly woman. She was battered, bruised, but her eyes were fierce. "I didn't let them touch him," she whispered. Isaac clenched his jaw, his entire body shaking with rage. He had spent years trying to be a good man, trying to build a life that didn't involve bloodshed and war, but Langley had crossed the line. Isaac gently cupped his son's face. "I need you to stay here, okay? No matter what happens." Elijah's lip trembled. "Are you going to stop them?" Isaac pressed a kiss to his forehead. "I'm going to end them." Then he stood, locked and loaded. Because now, this wasn't just a war, it was a reckoning. Isaac Carter had spent his entire life preparing for war. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy on foreign soil. This wasn't a mission with a clear objective. This was his son. And now someone had come into their home. They had dared to lay hands on the people he loved. Isaac had fought to leave that part of his life behind, to be a father, to raise his son away from the darkness. But when they came for Elijah, they awakened something they could never control. And now, he was going to make sure they understood one simple truth. You don't touch a father's child. The search begins. "Elijah," Isaac said softly, crouching down to meet his son's eyes. The boy had calmed a little, but his small hands were still trembling. His bottom lip quivered as he tried to be brave. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Elijah swallowed hard and took a deep breath, just like his dad had taught him. There were 2 men outside, he said quietly. They knocked on the door and said they were police. But they didn't have uniforms. Isaac's jaw clenched. They tried to grab me, but Mrs. Wilson hit one of them with a frying pan, Elijah said, eyes wide. Isaac glanced at the older woman. She was battered but unshaken. Damn right I did, Mrs. Wilson muttered. They weren't taking him anywhere. Isaac let out a slow breath, focusing. The men weren't here to hurt Elijah. If they were, they would have done it already. They wanted leverage, which meant they weren't working alone. And that meant Langley was getting desperate. Isaac pulled out his phone and dialed Miles. They tried to take him, he said without preamble. Miles cursed under his breath. Do you have them? No, Isaac replied, his voice cold. But I will. Miles hesitated. You want me to put a team together? Isaac closed his eyes. He could hear Elijah's breathing beside him, small and uneven. He could feel the way his son's tiny fingers clung to his sleeve. For years, violence had been his answer to every problem. Not this time. No, Isaac said. No teams, no fights. I want information. There was a pause. Then Miles exhaled. All right, I'll dig. Isaac ended the call and turned to Mrs. Wilson. I need you to take Elijah somewhere safe. Not leaving you, Elijah said immediately. Isaac placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. This isn't about leaving me. This is about protecting you. But, Elijah. His son bit his lip, looking down. Isaac softened, tilting his son's chin up. I need you to trust me, okay? I promise, I'll come back for you. Elijah hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Isaac pulled him into a tight hug, pressing his lips against his son's temple. I will always protect you. It was a vow. Following the trail. By the time Isaac reached his office at Sentinel Solutions, Miles was already waiting. I've got something, he said, handing Isaac a file. Inside was surveillance footage from a traffic camera. 2 men dragging his missing security officers into an unmarked SUV. The license plate had already been traced to a private airstrip outside the city. Isaac's gut clenched. Langley's moving assets. And he's not being subtle about it, Miles agreed. Isaac exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. If Langley was escalating, it meant he was feeling the pressure. He had made the first move, and now he was trying to take control. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated a father's resolve. Isaac wouldn't attack. He wouldn't hurt anyone. But he was going to bring everything Langley built crumbling down. A different kind of war. Isaac didn't need weapons to dismantle Langley's empire. He just needed the truth. That night, Isaac infiltrated the airstrip using nothing but his skill and a stolen security badge. No violence, no threats, just precision. Within an hour, he had accessed Langley's private files, downloading them onto an encrypted drive. And what he found changed everything. Bank records, blackmail material, wire transfers to politicians. Langley wasn't just running an underground military network. He was buying power. Isaac's eyes darkened. This is how you destroy men like Langley. Not with bullets, but with the weight of their own corruption. By sunrise, Isaac had sent the files to every journalist, investigator, and federal watchdog he could find, and within hours, the headlines started rolling in. Breaking news. High-ranking officials under investigation for corruption, bribery, and illegal weapons trade. FBI raids private airstrip linked to government scandal. Who is Victor Langley? Ex-general at the center of a national security breach. Langley had built his empire on secrets, and now Isaac had just burned it to the ground. The last call, Isaac was waiting when his phone rang. Langley's voice was tight with barely contained rage. You don't know what you've just done. Isaac leaned back in his chair, completely calm. I've done exactly what I promised. I didn't need to touch you, Langley. I just took away everything you had. Langley exhaled sharply. You think this is over? No, Isaac admitted. But you'll never have the power you once did. There was a long silence. Then Langley chuckled. You've changed, Carter. Isaac's grip on the phone tightened. No, I just finally learned what real strength looks like. And real strength wasn't about war. It was about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Homecoming. That evening, Isaac walked through the front door of Mrs. Wilson's house. Elijah was waiting. His son ran into his arms, hugging him tighter than ever before. Are we safe? He whispered. Isaac knelt down, pressing a hand to his son's heart. We're safe, buddy. And for the first time in a long, long time, he truly believed it, because for the first time Isaac Carter had won without becoming the man he once was. And that was the real victory.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.